people in, and we're doing that starting with the over 80s and care home residents and working our way down. And it is not currently the recommendation that people should be vaccinated out with those initial 4 groups between now and the 15th of February.
Could you take that specific case away for me? Because I don't think that's a satisfactory response for my constituent or anybody that is starting chemotherapy that is of a younger age group. I think it will cause a great deal of concern.
Well, I think it's...
And I'd very much like it if you take it away and see whether that could be changed.
Well, I'm more than happy to raise the point directly with Chris Whitty, absolutely. But as I say, ultimately, it is a set of clinical decisions that are then the health service is asked to give effect to. So it would be for the chief medical officers and for the JCVI to decide whether to do something different than what they've currently told us to do. But I don't know if Chris will.
I trust you to take that away and come back to me personally.
I think in the document that was published as we started this committee meeting, there's some changes or clarifications of the prioritisation. So we may find that that has taken the questioning. I'm now going to turn to Sir Geoffrey Clifton-Brown. So Geoffrey, if you could unmute, please. So Geoffrey, yours.
Yes, no, fine. Happy New Year to all our witnesses. So Simon, can I ask you 1 or 2 macro questions? Firstly, in the Prime Minister in his broadcast introducing the lockdown, so that if all went well, the first 4 priority groups would be vaccinated by the middle of February. Is that still on course?
Yes, it is on course, and the aim is to have been able to offer everybody in those first 4 groups an appointment by the 15th of February.
Can I clear up the total number of people you expect to vaccinate? Because the report has different views on this. On one point, it says your department wants to vaccinate everybody. At another point, it says that we need to vaccinate 70% of the population. And at another point, it says we need to vaccinate 25 million people. How many people do you intend to vaccinate or offer the vaccination to?
So within the first 4 priority groups in England, there are an estimated 12.2 million people. And so we aim to offer all 12.2 million people a vaccination before the 15th of February. How many of them choose to take up the offer will obviously reveal itself with each successive day and week. The central expectation is that around 3/4 of people may do so, but we believe it could be higher given that in this year's flu jab season, we've seen around 80% of people aged 65 and over choosing to accept the flu jab. And that's up by about 10 percentage points on last year. So the point is there's enough vaccine providing supply carriers coming on stream as we expect it to, that if all 12.2 million people say yes, then we can jab all 12.2 million people. If, on the other hand, some don't, as of course in the real world is likely, then that's vaccine that we can use for other people. And then in respect of and then in respect of the 25 million number that you referred to, Sir Geoffrey, which is mentioned in the NAO report, just to clarify, that's not now the number that we expect to be vaccinated during calendar year 2021. That is the estimated number of people who are in the full JCVI risk pyramid categories 1 through 9. In other words, everybody aged 50 and above, as well as the clinically extremely vulnerable. So we'd aim to be able to offer that group by spring, late spring, assuming vaccine supply carries on, and then all the rest of the country, the other 17.7 million adults in England, during the balance of the year. Does that Geoffrey clarify it?
It does. Thank you very much. Now, the rate of vaccination, again, you will have intelligence as to what this will depend, no doubt, on the supply of vaccines. The Prime Minister originally said that he wanted to vaccinate 2 million a week. He now says that he hopes that we will have 13 million vaccinated by mid-February. Now, that's stepping up a bit from the 2 million a week. How long, taking the previous answer, how long do you realistically think the sort of first category 9 lot will take? And then how long do you realistically think that the vaccination program will take through 21 to get all of those that really want the vaccination to be vaccinated.
We've covered some of this already, but Sir Simon, just give a quick recap.
As I said, yeah, no, that's a very, very good question. So as I said, I think we've got 2 sprints in a marathon. So we've got a sprint now to the 15th of February for the first
we covered this before.
12.2 million people.
I think Sir Geoffrey has having problems connecting before, so he didn't.
Yes, I'm sorry, Chair. If you've covered it, don't worry.
Okay.
So it was some of the other points.
Okay, so the Health Secretary had said by the autumn, Matt Hancock had said by the autumn, we would have hoped to be able to offer everybody in the country a vaccine who would want one.
That's very helpful. Thank you. Thank you.
Richard Holden, MP.
Thank you very much indeed, Chair. And one of the things that's concerning my constituents, and I'm sure in other parts of the country, is this localized data. Will we be getting localized breakdowns of data onto how many vaccines are going out, Sir Simon?
Yes, we will.
When?
Well, and how localized will they be? Will it be on CCG basis, county basis, constituency basis? Can you tell us any more?
Sure. So we will do a regional split. We will do a split by the STP, ICS areas, and then we're aiming to do a split at local authority level as well, if we're able to do that from the data. And we're aiming to do that within the next week or 10 days, so people can see how their own uptake is going. And if I might just say, Richard, it underlines the important role that local authorities and indeed directors of public health are going to have in the programme, not in calling people in, because this is an invite programme, so we can do it on a phased basis, but in helping ensure that when people do get that invitation, we see good uptake, including in groups who might traditionally have had a lower vaccine willingness or uptake.
I understand that. And so we've got the 13 million in the first wave up to the middle of February, and then 17 million in the second wave, roughly, nationwide. Are we expecting the speed of the second? You mentioned 2 sprints. Are we expecting the speed of the second to be quicker than the first because we'll have higher production by that point of the vaccine?
Our aim is sort of, as those 3 phases unfold, to be able to sort of each month, vaccinate in line with the vaccines we've got that month. So as we may come on to discuss, the fantastic work that's been done to procure vaccine means we should have a lot more by spring than we have now, and we'll have more in the summer than we have in the spring. So yes, we would expect the vaccination rate to increase as supply increases, and in turn, therefore, to be using many more partners in doing that. So, retail pharmacists will really come into their own when we've got all of this vaccine supply that we can put in their hands.
Okay, so we can expect those national breakdowns from today of the vaccines, and then within the next week to 10 days, that localized data that we asked for, just to be clear on that point.
Correct.
Great.
Correct.
And Chair, sorry, did you want me to move to allow Sir Richard, Sir Simon, sorry, to change his speaker?
Simon, the point that he needs to answer next, because then I think, Sir Simon, we've got some problems with your sound, which we're trying to sort out behind the scenes.
Right.
Sorry,
Chair. Just quickly, Sir Simon, on the treatment, and we've seen a huge updates in the treatment recently. I've had some questions locally about the use of vitamin C and vitamin D. Alongside the other treatments, is that something that you're rolling out as well now? I believe that it was piloted at Newcastle Hospital.
Yeah, let me get you a specific note, Mr. Holden, on the vitamin D question, because that has periodically cropped up. There are trials underway on it. Obviously, the new news this past week on treatments has been the repurposing of 2 rheumatoid arthritis drugs that have cut the relative risk of death in intensive care by 24%, and has also shortened the intensive care length.
So Simon, there's a problem with your sound, so if you could check, there's a back channel trying to contact you about that.
Okay, shall I dial off and dial back in? Is that
we'd rather discuss it on live air. But if you could just keep an eye on the backtrack, we're going to drop you off for a moment. I'm going back to Mr. Richard Holden to continue.
Yes, so if I could ask Ms. Bingham, please, just around, this is just quickly, there's been a lot of questions in the press around the EU and whether we were right to be part of that vaccine programme. I was just wondering, do we now know it was the right decision to definitely not be part of the EU programme? How quickly are we in advance compared to that EU programme? Where would we be in comparison?
So we talked about it in our report, actually, that's published in December. And the conditions that the EU set to allow us to participate were conditions we felt were not attractive, so that we were not able to join any decision making on which vaccines. We had to abandon the negotiations we either had underway or were had concluded with AZ. And we also were not able to talk to future potential vaccine companies that they may not be talking to currently, but would do in the future. So we felt the conditions were too tight, and that we would actually be able to act more quickly if we did it independently. Equally, we remained very close and supportive and continued discussions throughout to help them with their decision making and anything else that we could do. So we just thought it was a better approach for us, and I think in hindsight, that was the right decision, because we were able to secure the vaccines quicker and we were able to start vaccinating more quickly.
Indeed. And so on that terms of speed then, how much quicker do you think it's going to be looking at the UK is going to get that rollout, particularly for those vulnerable groups, compared to our friends in the EU?
So part of the reason for acting quickly was so that we could give the NHS teams time to prepare, because of course we didn't know which, if any, of these vaccines were going to work, and we did know that the mRNA vaccines have a highly complex, challenging supply chain with the short stability and minus 70-degree cold chain. So the longer the teams have to prepare, the quicker they'll be able to roll out when the vaccine's available. And I think that's played out. And so if you look at the stats, you can see what's happened in France and Germany and Netherlands. And I think our team has done phenomenally well. And the feedback I get from the mRNA companies is that they're highly organized, incredibly cooperative and supportive, and have formed an incredibly strong team. So I would absolutely like to call out my thanks for the amazing work done by Emily and the team.
Yeah. Well, we'll come to that. I think we'll come to that a little later on. So that's Mr. Holt.
Just one final question on that. So would you say, Ms. Bingham, we're a couple of months ahead of our European counterparts on this rollout program then, because we took a different approach?
Probably. I don't have I'm not privy to the details now, but so I read the headlines like you do, but I do know we've certainly had plenty more time to prepare for it, and therefore we should be doing it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. And we all know that for every 250 injections, that's really particularly for the elderly age group is really helping protect life. Coming to the main. We're going to
move on to the main session now. So
exactly.
So this is really using the NAO report. Thank you to them as a launch pad for our work, but obviously we're going to go a bit further as well. So I'm going to ask Richard Holden to take the floor once again. Mr. Holden, Richard Holden MP, could you
thank you very much, Chair. So we're just now going to drill down a bit, Ms. Bingham, into the taxpayers' interest element of this, because there's a huge amount of taxpayers' money has been spent here. Looking about 2.9 billion on the vaccines themselves, and then a much larger amount actually on the vaccine rollout program. Just wanting to ask, first of all, really, we started obviously buying vaccines before knowing whether they were safe and effective. So how on earth did you manage to decide which contracts you would go for and which would provide best value for money?
Thank you. So the starting point was to assemble a team of experts. So as I've said, I'm a therapeutic expert, not a vaccine expert. The distinction is whether people have a disease or whether they're healthy. In case of vaccines, we are vaccinating healthy people. So I pulled together a team of people who are both clinical, preclinical, regulatory and manufacturing experts who could help both triage the landscape of the different vaccine candidates and then perform the detailed work that we needed to actually assess the different characteristics of these different candidates. And the criteria we used were they sufficiently advanced that would allow entry into the clinic in 2020 and, if possible, approval in 2020? So our focus was very much to secure the most promising vaccines for the earliest possible deployment in the UK. So the first was about speed. Second is about the data itself that would support their ability to actually immunize and protect those who are most at risk. So that means these are vaccines that we needed to be convinced could work in the elderly. And we also needed to be ensure we could ensure that we could make them so that they could be scaled to the level that we could actually protect all those who need it in the UK. So those were the criteria that we used for triaging the different vaccine candidates that were out there. And of course, we have relationships. So I've been in the industry 30 years, and I think all but all the Western companies that we evaluated were companies where we had prior relationships in some way between at least one member of the team and those companies. So it meant that we were able to have meetings in evenings, Saturdays, weekends, and move things forward very quickly because we had a level of understanding and trust, both with companies that we did end up securing contracts with, as well as ones obviously that we didn't. So it was, and if I take you back to May, which is when we started, there was no evidence that any of these vaccines would work.
Indeed.
And so our portfolio strategy was ones that we wanted to optimize the chances of success, that if any of these different formats would work, that we had access to the most promising vaccine in that format.
Okay, so it's particularly around speed was the issue. And what premium were we paying on that speed then? Because obviously we're looking at 270 million doses, give or take, 2.9 billion pounds, roughly £10 a dose. What's the price differential between the different vaccines?
The mRNA vaccines are more expensive than the adeno vaccines, and the protein adjuvants and the whole inactivated viruses of vaccines are roughly in the middle. So the challenge is when we're negotiating, everyone is using the data that they've got at the time. And of course, none of these vaccine companies at that point had actually scaled up the manufacturing. And so they did not know at that point what their actual costs would be. So we, of course, struck deals so that we had firm pricing. And in some cases options for further vaccines, but there could not have been a discussion about premium because nobody actually knew what the actual costs were going to be. Nick, I don't know if you want to pick up on any of that.
Brilliant.
No, that's exactly right. So we didn't pay premiums for early access because people didn't know what the cost was going to be. What we did was we negotiated quickly and early. We got into contracts early, so we had heads of terms set up initially and then into supply agreements. And we built confidence and trust with the suppliers that allowed us to pursue those negotiations at pace. I think there is only one of our portfolio of vaccines where we did offer a slightly higher premium, a very small premium to get early access in 2020. But other than that, it's the position as Kate has just outlined.
And I'll just point out that we did secure the first contract with Pfizer-BioNTech, which was the first vaccine to actually get regulatory approval in any Western country. And we did that because we were quick and we were nimble, and we were clearly not the largest buyer. So the US and the European Union are much more substantial buyers than the UK. And yet we were both the first to secure the contract and the first to deploy.
And quite frankly, I'm slightly astonished that you didn't have to pay a premium, given that we aren't the largest buyer out there, and also that actually every month that goes by is billions of pounds to the economy. So you're talking of we'd have to pay this money anyway. So getting the economy moving again, there's naturally a huge benefit in getting the supplies out early. But moving on to the sort of the second point of this, so we know that you are acting basically going in blind, but trying to negotiate the best you could possibly do. I mean, how did you determine the different doses, the different dose numbers of the different ones, Ms. Bingham? Because it's quite a wide variety. 7 million for the Moderna, up to 100 million for AstraZeneca. Why did you go for those different numbers?
Of course. So the first thing we did was to talk to JCVI and ask them what numbers we should be using as our assumptions for the numbers of people who are vulnerable, or those people that they were going to recommend for vaccination. So their advice to us right at the beginning was 30 million people with a target. That's the groups 1 through 9 that they've since discussed. So that was our benchmark number. In some cases, if they're 2-dose vaccines, then it's obviously twice as many, 60 million doses. In the case of BioNTech, we got as much as we could for that early supply, and that's now 40 million doses as opposed to 60, and that's phased. And the reason the Moderna number is lower is we could have got the full amount, but it's, again, the supply timing was going to be too late. So because they prioritized, in Moderna's case, they prioritized manufacturing in the US, because it's a US company, ahead of Europe. Their European supply wasn't going to come online for at least a quarter after the time that US would come online. And then, so that basically captures all of them except for the AZ. And actually the AZ number assumes vaccination of the full population. And this, I think that number was actually defined before the VTF was formally set up. So that's basically for 50 million people.
I suppose there's two questions which follow on from that, Ms. Bingham. Is given we've now potentially got these 270 million-ish doses, do we expect to then go back and be buying more from any of the other suppliers, or do we think that these contracts are sufficient for what we need in the UK?
So the number of doses,
particularly in terms of speed, obviously.
Yeah, so the number of doses that are talked about in the NAO report actually only refer to the contracts that have been finally signed. We've actually signed LOIs for 2 more. So we've actually got 357 million doses.
Yep.
And that we've also got scope to increase, to have options on some of those. So the answer is we've got more doses than we're likely to need if they all work. And that's, of course, when we were signing the contracts, we didn't know whether or not that was going to be the case. Nick?
Yeah, no, I can understand that. And what are we going to do beyond? So with these extra doses, what happens? Are we bound into contracts on these, which we may now no longer need, or what are we going to do with the extra supply chain there if we are managing to vaccinate more rapidly than others?
Is that to Mr. Elliott? So sorry, who's that to? Because Mr. Elliott was one.
That's to Mr. Elliott. Yes, please.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Holden. So first of all, just a point of clarification, things move very fast in the Vaccine Task Force world. So since Kate has been gone, we're now actually up to 367 million doses because we secured another 10 million doses of the Moderna vaccine. And the reason we went for those additional ones is because we managed to secure them at an earlier time than we thought we were going to be able to get them. So that is another contingency option for us early. In terms of the overall what we do with those doses, it is too early to say because we don't actually know whether or not we're going to see the follow-on vaccines come through clinical trials and be successfully approved for use. And secondly, we've got to see what happens with the rollout as well, because there are always potential challenges to what happens with the rollout. What we've tried to do, though, is make sure we've got as much flexibility in each of the contracts as possible to allow us to not take those vaccines or to look at alternative disposal options. COVAX and the exchange mechanism in the international COVAX facility being one of the options that we have there.
Can I add, or Chris, do you want to, can I just add one more thing?
Briefly, Ms. Bingham, yes.
Sure.
So we also secured a deal with a Scottish company called Valneva, and this is a whole inactivated viral vaccine. And the reason, and this is only just, it's in the clinic now, but it will not be ready before the second half of next year. And the reason we did that, especially given the news about these mutations that we're seeing in the SARS-CoV-2 virus, is by having a whole inactivated virus means you have a much broader real estate of viral proteins against which the immune system can then generate antibodies and cellular responses. And so this, in many ways for us, is a tried and tested, proven vaccine platform with a much broader range of immune response. So it's unlikely that any viral mutations would actually escape a whole inactivated virus. And so that's why we've included that as part of our portfolio.
Ms. Bingham, thank you very much for that. That brings me very, very neatly indeed onto my next question, which I'm going to direct to Ms. Munby, if I can, Permanent Secretary at BEIS. So one of the implications of this is that we're going to be looking potentially at an annual vaccination programme. Is that something that we're now looking at in terms of this, Ms. Munby?
Of course, we're absolutely thinking about the fact that annual vaccinations may be required. It's too early to say whether they will be or not. We've got plenty of doses to be getting on with, not just for this year, but likely for next year as well. So we don't have an urgent and critical question about annual vaccinations, just to be clear. And we will have the luxury in that case of being able to take a little bit more time to survey the field. What couldn't be done this time round, which is comparing a set of vaccines against a clear set of criteria, because information was shifting all of the time, that approach will be more applicable to any future annual vaccination programme.
And on that potential future programme, Ms. Munby, what has been done to ensure future access to supply to protect taxpayers from potential price increases? Because I know at the moment this is very much a global pandemic. Everybody's throwing their weight in shoulder to the wheel. But what are we doing to ensure that in the longer term that taxpayers' money will be protected if we do end up down that route? Have we had those conversations with some of these companies already?
I mean, ultimately, we would expect that our negotiating position will improve over time because more vaccines are coming on stream, more vaccines are approved, there's more supply. So it's not a matter of locking ourselves in at the current price. It's actually taking the opportunity to renegotiate at the time at which annual vaccination becomes a certainty.
And that's a really good point there, timing. What is the timing if we do need to look forwards to annual vaccinations for next year? What are we going to be looking at? And when do those decisions actually need to be made in terms of from firstly, I suppose, from yourselves at BEIS, from a taxpayer and sort of production level?
Well, not for a while, simply because we've got enough for the whole of this year.
A while's quite general.
No, indeed, let me come on. We've got enough for this year. If you also come back to that 367 million doses, let's assume all of those reached approval, we'd have more than enough to revaccinate everybody next year if we wanted to. So we've got time in hand here. So we're not making an annual vaccination plan now because we don't know that one is necessary and we don't need to yet. But I can see Chris Wormald's got his hand up.
Yes, I was just wanting to dive over to the Permanent Secretary at the Department of Health. Mr. Wormald, do you want to add something to that?
Yes, I mean, it goes back to some of the unknowns I was describing earlier as well. So what the future vaccination scheme will be beyond the first round depends on those things, and also how the virus develops. Because, as you know, we already have some variants. So while we will be wanting to plan for the future, we will want to do so when the right information is available on all of those issues.
No, indeed. And so, Chris, on the right information, I mean, part of the problem with this is we've already seen this quite significant, several mutations, the South African variant, obviously the one which was identified in the UK. And as Ms. Bingham mentioned, looking at this wider element of the vaccine, this one we're looking at for Scotland, or has been produced potentially in Scotland. If we could be looking at having to do a vaccination program for next year with an updated virus, as we do with the annual flu jabs, in a matter of months. Is this something which is under active planning at the moment?
Well, I'll say various things about that, and then Kate will come in. I was about to say Kate will be in a better position to answer some of those things. One couple of things I will say. I mean, viruses mutate. All viruses mutate. We see this with flu every year. Now, once you have got a base vaccine, creating alternative versions of that vaccine for new variants is considerably easier, as we do every year with flu. So once you've got a vaccine that you can adapt. And some of the technological advances and speed advances that have been made over COVID compared to how vaccines are normally developed, which takes maybe 5, sometimes 10 times longer than has been managed this time, ought to mean that we can also create vaccines for new variants if those are necessary at greater speed, but there's still a lag. Now, I suspect where we will need to get to is the same kind of global surveillance that is done on flu, where, as you know, people identify flu strains in advance and on a world basis change production, if that is the way this virus goes to. And I am stressing here the unknowns in this, because obviously it still remains a very new virus that we have a lot to learn about. But Kate, would you like to add?
Well, thank you, Sir Chris. I think what you've described as we need to make this as simple as an annual flu jab is exactly the strategy that we've taken on at the VTF. I've written about it in Nature, actually, because there are clearly things that we can do to act more quickly next time and make this just much more routine as part of both surveillance and then production of vaccines. So some of the things we've put in place from the vaccine task force is to think about how can we improve the manufacturing, improve the scale up, and fundamentally how can we improve the actual vaccine formats, because at the moment they require needles, we have 2 doses, they require cold chains, they require healthcare professionals to administer. None of those are ideal for vaccines if they need to be given repeatedly. So we need to actually be developing vaccine formats which are ideally oral or buccal or intranasal, or even a patch where you can just get it sent it in the post, and that basically will then protect you for whatever period it may be.
Ms. Bingham, you raise again, you preempt my next sort of question and lead me neatly on to go to Ms. Mumby and Mr. Elliott. To Ms. Mumby, we're looking at, obviously some of the payments we've made in advance to these firms have been to help start manufacturing process and to support clinical trials. Given the early investment in some of these from the government, why was it not possible to pursue perhaps more on the intellectual property rights as part of these negotiations?
I'll let Nick add to this, because I'm sure he'll want to talk about it, but it's fair to say that all of these vaccines have been developed for global use. Vaccine manufacturers have been talking to people across the world, and the idea that we could have realistically acquired intellectual property rights over the vaccines was not seriously on the table. Of course, if it had been, we would have been, open to having that discussion. But ultimately, the intellectual property here is probably owned in the right place, which is the people who are designing and making the vaccines. And we need to be an outstanding buyer of those vaccines, both now and in the future.
I understand. Mr. Elliott, do you want to add something on this point?
Not really. I think Ms. Mumby's covered it adequately. I think the only thing I would say is that it's only where clinical development has been funded that you'd have that option anyway, really, because the investment in manufacturing has been on the basis that it's been an upfront payment, but it's recovered through the cost of the vaccine that's coming back later anyway. So it's not something that you've actually given to those companies, sort of to keep. It is something that's been recovered through the cost of the vaccine.
I mean, we have been putting some of this cash into the clinical development, though, haven't we? To support the clinical development of the vaccine program.
Yeah, but that cost again is being recovered through the cost of the vaccine. So that is not and that's only where we've been conducting trials in the UK, and it's therefore giving us the ability to gain access to those vaccines. So we've got commercial arrangements in place for pretty much everything that gives us those costs back.
Okay, I'm going to hand over to Mr. Bailey now, who's going to develop this theme a little more. Sean Bailey, MP.
Sean Bailey.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to take a step back a minute in terms of actually what Mr. Holden talked about in terms of upfront payments. I mean, we've heard from the National Audit Office that £914 million of upfront payments were made for some of these vaccines. So I'm just conscious to develop slightly a side theme here. How did we model the risk on these payments? And maybe this is one for Ms. Bingham, because I'm conscious that when we made these payments, one would give us a full refund in the event that we achieve regulatory approval, 2 required a partial refund in the event of non-regulatory approval of vaccines, and 2 are non-refundable. So I'm just conscious, what is the risk to the taxpayer there?
The risk was substantial for the upfront payment. So in my appointment letter, it was quite clear that the focus was to secure vaccines for the UK as soon as possible, and that would mean taking on costs for manufacturing at risk before we know whether or not those vaccines were safe and effective and approved by the regulators, so that if they were approved, we would then have manufacturing processes and vaccines ready to start deployment quickly. So when I was on the actual vaccine expert advisory group, which predated the VTF, that was a question actually I asked the vaccine experts as to what is the likelihood of success of these vaccine candidates. And across the board, the feedback was vaccines that are actually already in the clinic probably have a maybe 15% chance of success, maybe 20%. And vaccines that are yet to go into the clinic, we should assume less than 10% chance of success. So there's no doubt that we took on risk to do the manufacturing scale up to for a range of different vaccines, and that's basically what the upfront costs are for. It was to allow those companies to invest in the manufacturing so that they would have doses available should they be successful. And that was an explicit strategy set out by the PM so that we could actually be quick to start deploying if any of these vaccines proved to be safe and effective.
Okay, thanks, Ms. Bingham. I mean, the one thing I would say there is obviously 20% and 10% are quite significant. You know, there's quite a high degree of risk there in terms of those figures that you've just quoted. I mean, in terms of the existing risk that's still there, because obviously not all of those vaccines, you know, we've not had complete approval yet. What is the outstanding risk currently to the UK taxpayer?
Nick, obviously, do you want to answer that?
Yeah,
so, Mr. Bailey, when you look at the portfolio, if we had not made that investment, then you would not have vaccines available at the point of regulatory approval. And looking at the overall value for money business case of vaccines, weighed against the cost of the pandemic, it only takes one of those vaccines to be successful to vastly recover, you know, for the taxpayer, the investment that's been made at risk. Actually, we're in the fortunate position now of having 3 of those portfolio vaccines which have been approved for use, and hopefully we'll see some more as well. So I think it's almost the wrong question. The question has got to be, what is the success of the portfolio as a whole? Because that's the value for money criteria that was taken forward in terms of funding the programme.
And I might add that of the 7 vaccines we have, 3 are approved, a further 2 are in final pivotal phase 3 trials. So Janssen and Novavax, I would hope will be releasing their phase 3 initial interim efficacy data this quarter. And then the latter 2, which is Valneva and GSK Sanofi, will be the second half of the year. So I think the portfolio has developed just absolutely as well as we could have hoped. And the fact that we've had to pay up front is exactly, or at least a portion up front, is so that we can start deploying quickly.
Mr. Bailey.
Okay, thank you. I mean, Chair, obviously I completely appreciate and agree with the sentiment that obviously the availability of a vaccine is absolutely vital and obviously is a benefit from taking this risk. But obviously my question was more around the fact that, you know, in terms of raw figures, what is the taxpayer putting out? Because the purpose of our committee is to obviously look at value for money for the taxpayer. Now, notwithstanding that the value for money is in that vaccine, I'm just curious to know, as of right now on the books for that portfolio, what are we still risking there? I don't disagree at all with the sentiment that actually the outcome of having those vaccines is absolutely a risk worth taking, but I'm just curious to understand what that risk is.
There will always be risk in biological manufacturing because we are growing living mammalian cells, and this is non-predictable. It's not like stamping out PPE equipment. This is highly complex, non-linear scale up, which is non-predictable precisely because of the nature of these processes. So we do have a phenomenal group of people working on it, and I think all that is generally working pretty well. But if I just nail your point about value for money, if we wanted the cheapest vaccines, we would have said we'd be happy to receive the vaccines in 2022. I have no idea how much cheaper they would be, but they would be cheaper, because what we wanted was the most scarce resource, which is the vaccines that are available as soon as they came off the production line in those early days. So it is a trade-off to say, what are the costs we're paying? About £10 a dose. So again, I don't think it's excessive, and it's in line with what we pay for flu. But if we wanted to focus purely on price, which we did not, then that would have been at a cost of delivery date.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair. I just also want to look a little bit very briefly into priority access as well. And maybe this is equally one for Ms. Mumby. So obviously we know that the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy has invested around 519 million in manufacturing capability. Do you think that investment is enough to ensure that the risks that we have over some of the priority access arrangements we've got? So, for example, if the UK supply chain fails, or if we can't meet those capacity, we can't access those vaccines. Do you think that that 590 million has sort of balanced off that risk?
Yes. So, a couple of comments on manufacturing. First of all, it's, I think, important to say that in the main, manufacturing is the responsibility of the people who are supplying us the vaccines, and in most cases they're large companies with pre-existing supply chains. Their manufacturing they give to us. The investments that we've made, particularly in VMIC and CGMIC, each of those investments has a significant capacity. You'll see it described in the Vaccines Task Force report at the end of last year as up to 70 million doses in the first 6 months of operation for each of those facilities. So those come on stream second half of this year and end of this year. That is a sufficient manufacturing capacity to manufacture all of the vaccines we might need in a year if we had to do that. So we have got kind of full contingency manufacturing capacity within UK HMG owned facilities. As it happens, we're not currently using that capacity. It's not on stream yet. And most of the manufacturing is being done entirely through the auspices of the people that we've contracted with, and that's fine too. But as we look ahead to those uncertainties about mutation, about annual vaccination and so on, having built up that capability for the UK to be confident that we can do our own manufacturing if we need to is a really important legacy of this work.
So just so I'm clear on what you're saying, then you're basically you are confident that the UK has enough of a supply chain there partly through the investment obviously that your department's put in to ensure that we can manufacture these vaccines going forward, and in the event of an annual vaccination drive that's needed, we would be able to meet the demand that's there through the UK supply chain.
If we wanted to manufacture it in our own facilities, which we might or might not, depending on who we were buying it from, we could.
Okay.
It's probably worth noticing what we've done in VMIC and CGMIC is to put in state-of-the-art bioprocessing equipment that is not fixed. So these are not fixed steel drums. These are flexible bioprocessing capabilities that allow us to manufacture different kinds of format. So we can manufacture viral-based vectors, mRNA vaccines, protein adjuvant vaccines, as well as antibodies. So the one things they can't manufacture are the whole inactivated viruses, because that requires very specific containment facilities, and that's what we do with Valneva in Scotland. But the other formats, at least the formats that are currently active in the vaccine space, are all ones that we can manufacture. Will they need to be updated in due course as formats develop? Of course. But will we have state-of-the-art manufacturing once CGMIC and VMIC are up and running with the different, and including people like CPI up in Darlington, who provide very valuable lipid nanoparticle capability, that will actually provide the capability that we need to manufacture vaccines in the UK.
Mr. Bailey.
Okay, thank you, Chair. I want to move on now, if I can, to indemnities and the indemnities that have been taken out in respect of the vaccines. This is probably this is a two-part question, really, actually, probably from Ms. Bingham, and then also I wanted to talk about some of the indemnity support that's had to have been offered for community pharmacy. So, in terms of for the vaccinations, though, for these vaccines, the indemnities that have had to be entered in as part of the contractual process, could you just talk me through again some of the risk modelling that was done around that, how that operated, and in a worst-case scenario, what would be the impact to the taxpayer?
I'm going to hand that over to Nick, actually, if that's okay.
Mr. Elliott.
Thank you. So I think you've got to start off from what the position of each of these suppliers was, and that they were all seeking statutory protection of some form, just as has been given in the US with the PrEP Act. What we did was we took advice across from ministers and from all of the different departments, including health, as to what line we should take, and it was agreed that we should negotiate independently with each of those suppliers. But it was absolutely a red line for every manufacturer that they wanted some form of statutory protection, or if not, then some form of liability cover to provide them with confidence that they could produce these new vaccines. We have got slightly different agreements and arrangements in place with regard to indemnities with each of the manufacturers, but on the whole, they are provided with fairly broad indemnities, and we've written to the chair of the committee with an outline of what those are. Those indemnities actually come into existence at the point in which the vaccines are given. And so every time we start a vaccine programme with one of those vaccines, then we will lay before Parliament through the chair at the moment what the indemnity is. We have not been specific about that for a whole variety of reasons, and I'm not sure in this particular form I would want to go into the specific details of those, but they have been made available to the committee.
No, and thank you, Mr. Elliott, and obviously we're grateful for that. I'm just the point I suppose I'm really trying to get at, Chair, is when, in the throes of the negotiation around these indemnities, was there any form of modelling done as to what may happen, as you were taking that risk decision, because ultimately it's going to be a risk-based decision as to enter into these indemnities, as what that worst case scenario could be in terms of, what would happen if it all went wrong, basically, and how was that done? I'm just interested to understand a bit more about the process that was followed as you were negotiating these indemnities. And, I appreciate the explanation and that is understood, but I'm just wondering how the risk modelling was done, really.
So everything was modelled, and the numbers that you will see in the information that's been made available to the committee includes the modelling, the worst case modelling that has been done. So what have you been provided with is the worst case position that you will get for each of those vaccines.
Okay, that's great. Thank you, Chair.
It's probably worth pointing out, though, that if we didn't offer indemnities, we would not be securing vaccines. So, I mean, this wasn't a choice. If we either were going to agree some level of indemnity with the different vaccine suppliers, or we wouldn't be securing that vaccine at all.
Okay. And are you saying that, Ms. Bingham, because the indemnity cost would be so high that the companies would have wanted to go through more rigorous testing before putting it on the market ordinarily?
There's such enormous demand for the early vaccines that all the different vaccine companies had countries queuing up to do bilateral deals. And if we said we weren't prepared to offer a level of indemnity, they would have just gone to the next country on the list. And since we were mostly first, they had a lot of other places to go to after us.
Okay.
Yeah, and if I could just add, I mean, actually, you may remember, Chair, this is not an unusual thing for governments to do. We did it during the swine flu epidemic, and we understand that most countries a lot of countries around the world are doing the same in this. So it's exceptional in that we only do it during emergencies, but during emergencies, it's something there is precedent for.
Yeah, and certainly we could get into a squirrel hole debate on this, because sometimes it can also reduce the cost of something relative to the risk of the indemnity. That's slightly different perhaps in this situation. Mr. Bailey, anything else from you?
No, I'm done, Chair. Thank you.
Okay, and can we just check that those indemnities, they apply across all of the purchased vaccines wherever they're deployed, whether that's Crown dependencies or to the devolved administrations? That's the same. This just goes with the purchase. Yep.
Yes.
From Mr. Elliott. Yep. I'm going to hand now over to Olivia Blake, MP. Over to you, Ms. Blake.
Thank you, Chair. And I've got quite a lot of ground to cover, so I'm going to ask some quite sharp questions, so I'd appreciate sharp answers. The first question really is about the 12-week wait decision, and this is to Chris Wormwald, if that's okay, about why this decision was made, and can you outline that?
This is the delay to the second dose that we introduced. Well, the very short answer is we followed the advice of JCVI and the chief medical officers that the best public value in public health terms was to get the first dose to the maximum number of vulnerable people as quickly as possible, as opposed to the alternative strategy of giving second doses to the same people. Worth emphasising that the second dose is still very important. It's the way Professor Whitty describes this is the first dose gives you protection and the second dose gives you durability. But the basic reason we did it was for the public health reasons, as I say, set out by JPCI and the CMOs.
Ms. Blake, back to you.
This decision was clearly taken before the full lockdown. Do you think that the decision could have been different, and will it be reviewed at different stages throughout different lockdowns?
Well, it wasn't explicitly linked to the lockdown, but obviously the faster the disease is spreading, the more important it is to maximise the number of vulnerable people who've had the first dose. We keep all these things constantly under review as the evidence base develops. But the basic maths of it's better to have a larger number of people with first dose protection than a much smaller number with the double dose protection. We think that's a very strong argument.
Given that, Do you think that this delay will automatically be considered for all the vaccines on your list? And will you be asking the producers to provide you with sufficient evidence given that?
Well, it's directly driven by the evidence. I only know the details for the vaccines that we are using. It would depend upon the data about individual vaccines and then the advice of JCVI and the CMOs on what the best public health value is. So I don't think we can generalize about vaccines on this point. It has to be a data-driven and public health decision.
Could I just add one to that? If you remember, the Oxford trial was a single dose protocol originally. And then when they looked at their phase 2, one of the arms had 2 doses, and then it was clear that the 2 doses did better. So then the people who had been vaccinated in the phase 3 trial were then asked to come back for their second dose. And that's why, we haven't seen it yet, but the MHRA have got the data. That's why they have a spectrum of data showing what the immunogenicity looks like from 4 weeks through to 12 weeks. So actually, I think when that data is published, there will be strong experimental data supporting that. We may not get that in other vaccine trials because most other vaccine trials have a very fixed duration between doses. But it isn't. It is well understood that the longer you spend between doses actually does improve the immunogenicity. So I think it's of course the right thing to do from a public health perspective, but I don't think you're going to get that same granular data that with other vaccines than we've seen with Oxford.
Yeah, thank you, Ms. Bingham. You've undercut one of my questions, which my next question is, what support will you give to make sure that we're following up on this and making sure that that body of evidence is there for all the vaccines on the list? And do you feel that that should be something that we should invest in?
So one thing we have invested in is the human challenge model. So basically the way the trials have been run up until now have been in very traditional, large, placebo-controlled studies where you're basically comparing people who've been vaccinated against people who have not to show that the vaccination actually provides the protection. It's very difficult to do that, obviously, in countries where vaccines are being rolled out because precisely the people that you want to protect are now being vaccinated. So that the human challenge model is one where you actually take young, fit volunteers and you deliberately infect them to then start looking at the next generation vaccines in highly, highly controlled conditions. So you can start teasing out the mechanism of how the different vaccines work. And you can start pulling out, for example, immune correlates of protection, because you can test, for example, the nasal epithelia and the immune cells before infection as well as after infection in a controlled way, which you simply can't do in the large trials. So what we have been doing with the Department of Health, which has worked really well, has been doing some of these first ever initiatives so that actually we will be in an incredibly strong position to help support the development of next-gen vaccines and to optimize the dosing protocols precisely to generate that data that you've suggested.
Yeah, and we will also have the data from the surveillance programs that we are running on the vaccine rollouts overseen by PHE and MHRA.
Okay, so Wormold, if it's okay, would you know the date that data is going to be in the public domain, and how? I'm going to come on to confidence in a second, but how confident are you that, given the approach, and I fully accept the approach, is to get as much out the door as possible, how confident are you that you're going to have supplies enough for each of the second doses of each of the vaccines?
Well, I mean, we've covered the supply position in detail already, and as Sir Simon has already set out, our delivery models are based on the availability of supply covering both the first dose and then the delayed second dose. So those are all built into the models. I can't give you an exact date by which particular bits of data will be available, because I mean, obviously a lot of this is research data, as Kate has just described.
Yeah.
But basically, our data will get better all the time.
But Sir Chris, you're quoting data at us. We haven't seen it. When will that be available to the public in any form, whether the whole data set or a summary of it? You've given us some information today, but when are we going to see more detail?
Yeah, well, I mean, the data we publish about the vaccine program should get more granular over time. I think, as Simon described earlier, we're going to daily publication today, and then it'll become, as I say, more granular over time. And then there will be
sorry to interrupt. Do you think that it would be of international imperative and kind of use to try and speed up that data publishing? Well, for the reasons that the UK are doing things differently.
We're hitting a balance here. Obviously, we want to make as much data as transparent as possible, but it has to be robust. And we have seen in other instances in the pandemic where we have been strongly criticised for data publications that did not meet some people's statistical standards. So in this case, we are very, very keen to hit the right balance of course, getting as much out as quickly as possible, but making sure that it meets the statistical standards that people also want to see. So it will be an evolving picture, but there will be more and more granular data on the actual rollout, as Simon has described, and more of the research data that Kate has been pointing towards over time. I can go away and look at whether we can say anything about the timing of that. I don't have dates for you at the moment. I'll come back to the committee if there's something more specific I can say on the research data side.
Thank you.
Can I just add on supply? So if you just take the 3 vaccines that have all been conditionally approved, that vaccinates the entire UK adult population without any of the additional vaccines getting approved.
No, I appreciate that. I just want to ask about the Dr. Lawson, if that's okay, about the likelihood of turning up 3 months later and how you can counter in your communications. And I think Sir Wormald hinted at this about patients now thinking that 1 dose is sufficient and enough.
Thank you for the question. So we're using a number of interventions to try and make sure people do return for their second dose. So, for example, when we ask GPs and the primary care networks to switch from the 2 doses to single dose, we ask them to rebook the appointment, not just cancel it. At the moment, that's a mixture, and we need to support the PCNs in making sure that second appointment is booked in. And we indeed had a conversation with the CCGs last night about that to make sure that's in place. When you book an appointment at a vaccination centre, you book 2 appointments at the same time. So you book both your first dose and second dose, so that appointment will be in there for you. And when we set people up at hospital hubs, we ask them to do the same thing. Of course, the vaccination event is recorded in your GP record. So we can use the ability to interrogate the GP record to look at whether you've returned in time for your second dose and to follow up accordingly. So we're both trying to preempt it by making sure the vaccination is in there, and then also make sure we've got the surveillance to follow up where that doesn't happen.
Thank you. And another one for you, Dr. Lawson. The absolute last resort guidance, and I'm using that phrase, of sort of mix and matching. What tests have there been of the efficacy of mixing 2 different vaccines? And would it be advisable to offer a 3rd jab in these circumstances? And also, finally, on that point, would indemnity cover such a clinical choice?
So I think it's worth clarifying. I think you're referring to the paragraph in the Green Book that talks about if somebody shows up and you can't track what their first vaccine was. And so I'm thinking that Mr. Brodie may want to come in on that from the Public Health England perspective, having his team having written the guidance. I do think it's really important to emphasise that that's written as a lot. This is we don't expect this to happen. The only situation in which that would happen is somebody didn't have their first dose in the UK at the moment, because we do have this ability to look back in the GP record to see which vaccine you received, which would not only tell you what vaccine it was, but also which batch number, etc. So it's an extremely unlikely occurrence.
My understanding is there is a clinical trial being set up to look at whether that would indeed be efficacious, but that's clinical data that needs to be examined and prepared. So we don't have a program set up for that now, because that isn't how the program's set up. The program is set up to give you the same dose at 12, the same vaccine at 12 weeks that you had in the first week.
Can we just be clear, Dr. Lawson, because there's been some talk, perhaps loose talk, about mixing vaccines and the danger of that. Can you be absolutely categorical from what you said? There is no plan to mix vaccines. There just may be an occasional patient who's received a vaccine outside the NHS who then needs a vaccination.
Yes, I can answer this. To be clear, that is not the policy of the government, and as Emily has made clear, there is no data to support that approach. As Emily has said, there's some very exceptional circumstances.
Yeah. I think so. Just to summarize, there is no plan.
But it is not the policy, and as I say, there's no data to support that approach.
So just be clear. So what I've said is absolutely so. No plan to mix vaccines on a routine basis. Just to be clear. Just to get that public health message out there, because I think there's been some confusion in the media. Dr. Lawson's nodding as well. Right. So Michael Brodie, to you.
Just to say that's absolutely the Public Health England position as well. Yeah.
Thank you. Ms. Blake.
Just to Sir Simon Stevens and to Michael Brodie again, if that's okay, Mr. Brodie. What are the main risks of deploying each of the 5 different vaccines that have been purchased so far?
So I'm happy to go first on this. So the biggest challenge is with the Pfizer vaccine, because obviously you're aware of the cold chain storage and it has to kept at minus 70 degrees. So we have ultra low temperature freezers in our storage in our warehouse, and we have isothermic boxes packed with dry ice, which we use while transporting. Clearly, as your warehouse operatives are picking from those freezers, we have to do that in a structured way, which is why we've put in place the robust ordering process, which was reported on last week, but has a specific cut-off time, which gives us the certainty and the data and the consistency to allow us then to through our supply chain partners to pick the right number of batches in a safe and controlled way. So with Pfizer, the big issue is around the securing the cold chain throughout. With Oxford, it's a 2 to -8 degrees product, much easier, much more like other vaccines, and bear in mind that we have a track record of dealing with 17 different vaccination programs. We do in a normal year 300,000 deliveries a year. This is the kind of expertise that we already have. So with all humility and not taking anything for granted, the risks with the Oxford vaccine are much less.
Okay, Ms. Blake.
And what about the other 3? And that's the kind of key here. Are we going to see any more difficulties from the other 3, or are you confident that the Pfizer one's the most tricky?
So Pfizer's the most tricky, but I'll defer to the vaccines task force around the specific characteristics of the other vaccines.
Yeah. So thank you. So the Janssen vaccine is likely to be very similar to the AZ one, because it's also another adeno-based vaccine. So that will be basically traditional vaccine cold chain and should be manageable. The Novavax vaccine, which is a protein-based, adjuvanted protein-based vaccine, again, is a well understood vaccine format, which will be the same as Oxford, so it'll be a standard supply chain, cold chain, and I think will be manageable. So the tricky ones have been the mRNAs, because these are very, very unstable bits of genetic material. And then Valneva again will be standard supply chain, cold chain. So I think that we started with the most tricky, and it's getting easier in terms of the characteristics of the vaccines.
Can I say, Ms. Bingham, when you were looking at the vaccines, did you consider these issues when you were working out which ones to buy, or was it obviously speed was a high priority?
We did consider it, but the question was it deployable? And I think if we'd felt it was completely not deployable, we wouldn't have progressed. But the challenges obviously were the short stability, and of course, as the vaccines are developed, the stability actually increases. It's just you're limited in terms of knowing how long the shelf life is going to be, because you're measuring it as you're developing the vaccines. So yes, we did consider it, and when we realised that actually it was a matter of highly organised and complex planning, as well as having the right minus 70-degree fridges, then we felt that Emily Lawson and the team could do it. So we didn't turn off anything because of difficulty of deployment, but we did flag that it was going to be more expensive and difficult to deploy than a more standard one.
And I should add, Chair, although we've run this programme in 2 chunks with 2 accounting officers, Kate and the Vaccine Task Force have involved the delivery chain at all points in their systems, and likewise on our side of the house we involve the Vaccine Task Force in what we do. So each strategy is informed by the other. They haven't been done as two separate with a throw over the wall in the middle.
Okay.
I might just come in here.
Come on to who's responsible properly later. Ms.
I might come in here if I may, just to point out, I think it's always worth remembering that at the beginning of this programme, we had very high levels of uncertainty. So when we started, we did not know whether any vaccine would work. And it was entirely possible that the only vaccines that might have worked would be the ones that required a very complex supply chain. So we gave DHSC a really tough ask, because we said you need to be prepared for the most difficult, as fast as possible, because that might have been the only option we had.
Thank you.
Thank you. Just going on, obviously you want the same vaccines going to the same place, so the second delivery can be the same thing. There's been some teething problems kind of reported anecdotally, of double the vaccines appearing at GP practices, and people expecting one type of vaccine and eventually getting the other. What would you say about how are you tracking and making sure that you're going to get the right vaccine to the right place, and what level of wastage have you had of the harder to keep one so far, if any? And that's to
Ms. Lawson, Dr. Lawson.
Dr. Lawson.
Thank you. Yes. So any arrival which hasn't exactly hit the mark is obviously a mistake that we then look into and figure out how we operationally improve. And I think it's worth bearing in mind that 97.3% of the vaccine deliveries have been on time and in full, and 98.15% of all of the deliveries, because of course we've delivered over 100 million individual items as part of the vaccine deployment over the last 6 weeks. So it's, however, the 2.7% are still very troubling for the people who are on the receiving end, and obviously affect recipients. So every time something goes wrong, we obviously investigate what exactly happened and how do we make sure it doesn't happen again. So one of the challenges we discovered last week was that the communications which were sent to each site, each PCN site, there were 1,380 deliveries last week of vaccine. Those letters were sent out at the end of the previous week, but some of them hadn't arrived before the vaccine because they've been held up in the communications chain. So we've now changed the communications chain, so it's not a chain, it's just a direct communication to the site, so we know when we press send that it's being received on the same day. So that's just one example. It's part of our ongoing operational improvement process to take that feedback and then figure out how we do better the next day or the next week. The other thing we've done, which I think came up right at the beginning of the conversation, is we've now sent out supply information to PCNs, not just for this week, but for next week, as of the end of day today, so that they can plan ahead. Now, what that also means is we will call some individual PCNs if additional supply becomes available and say, look, can you take some extra? Because actually we've got more next week than we thought we had. So it's a mixture of getting at least a base level of stability in there so people can plan ahead, but also, respecting the fact that we want to get vaccine into arms as quickly as possible. So a bit of agility is definitely a good thing.
Okay, just going back to the kind of regionality of this, what oversight is there currently of local decision making around this programme? Do you feel confident that, for example, 80+-year-olds are being done first, and then, or is it being done differently in different localities? How quickly they're moving through those lists, because obviously the populations are very different in different parts of the country.
Sorry, I assume that's to me, but
yes, sorry.
I inappropriately dived in, apologies. So we are absolutely tracking that, and age is a relatively straightforward thing to track because obviously it's associated with your GP record. So while there are always individual data quality issues as we evolve the programme, certainly indicatively we know how many over 80s are being vaccinated. and so that the way that the supply is allocated to the PCNs, and we've now, sorry, primary care networks, and we're adjusting that as we go along as well, is we looked at those with the largest number of over 80s to start off with, and they were part of the first tranche, and also were the ones we called last week, for example, where we had additional supply due to the relaxation of the 2-dose time, and also asked them to take additional supply last week. What we are doing, not so much for this week, but for the end of the month, is to then make sure there is additional supply going to further PCN, have a very big cohort, not just cohorts 1 and 2, but also cohorts 3 and 4 as we move through the programme, because it's not evenly split across PCNs, as you say. So we're looking at basically their registered patient database and making sure they get sufficient supply to register the cohorts in roughly the right order, while also not holding up overall deployment, because equally we want to get all of the doses out every week. What's worth bearing in mind, of course, is the care home relationships as well. So every PCN is linked to a number of care homes, and that needs a particular kind of deployment activity. So we're making sure that the AstraZeneca vaccine, for example, which makes that easier, has gone to every active PCN last week. They all got 1 box towards the end of last week, and then they'll be sending more to make sure they've covered all of their care homes, because that's not evenly split across the country either.
Okay. And finally, the last kind of question I have about regionality really is clearly how are decisions being taken to prioritise where the kind of mass vaccinating sites are? Is this driven by population, or is it driven by the number of cases? How are those decisions being made, and will those decisions be flexible, and will we see any more than those 11 sites come online?
Yes, so there are 7 sites starting today, as you know, and then there'll be 10 next Monday, and then more before the end of the month. So as you haven't had a chance to read yet, but in the deployment strategy, it says we will have 50 by the end of the month. So those sites are all identified and working their way towards being ready. So the way we selected all of the sites, not just the the large scale vaccination centres, was to make sure there was as even a spread of geography as we possibly could. So starting with the first 50 hospital hubs that started on the 8th of December, looking at the first set of primary care network sites, we started from a local basis, making sure there was coverage, using the support of the military planners that we have, who can put things very precisely on a map, look at coverage of population. We looked at it against deprivation indexes as well, to make sure we didn't inadvertently miss that particular angle. And basic geography, looking at travel times and making sure that each PCN would be stood up over time, or if not, we had an alternative mode to deliver, for example, through community pharmacy, which will also stand up over the next couple of weeks. So the intent from the beginning has been to get to all of the cohorts as quickly and as safely as possible, recognising we couldn't do everything in one big bang. So each tranche of sites has been spread across the country, recognising that when you only stand up a certain number of sites in a week, it's spread across the country, but that still means there are individual areas that need further attention. So as we go through, we've explicitly tried to fill those gaps in.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ms. Blake. I'm now going to turn to Dame Cheryl Gillen, MP. Dame Cheryl, over to you.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to probe a bit more about the promises that are being made, because I've had the chance to skip read the vaccines delivery plan, and I'm still concerned about the logistics of whether we will be able to deliver on the promises that have been made. And as the government has been criticised for over-promising and under-delivering, I think these are really quite key. As far as I'm concerned, we know how much we've ordered of each vaccine, but there has not been a timetable for delivery of those vaccines at all. And I wondered if you are satisfied that the manufacturers can, in fact, deliver the vaccines at a speed and to the places that can meet the government targets that they've already announced.
You want me to take that?
Yes, that'll be fine. Thanks.
And then Ms. Lawson.
So the way we've worked with the companies, with each of them, is as part of diligence and part of contracting, is to set out timing of supply contracts and timing of deliveries. And of course, we're doing that without in each case, any of those vaccines being fully scaled to their commercial scale and amount, because we're right at the front and we're right at the beginning. So what we do know is we are getting our share of the vaccines, and we are absolutely getting the vaccines that are available, which we have for the UK, we are receiving. But the challenge is doing the scale up. Once we're
Ms. Bingham, you and I come from you know, a commercial or semi-commercial background in your case. I think, you know, I would expect to see a timetable, you know, actually setting out the numbers.
Yes, we have a timetable, but the timetable is based on the most available data that we've got, where we don't have these production manufacturing facilities at full scale. So the challenge is in the scale up. Once you're at the scale, then it's cranking a handle, because then you've got the procedures and the processes and the quality sign-offs and so on all in place. But what's not there is what actually are they going to be able to deliver versus what is expected to be able to deliver. And Nick, do you want to come in?
We have got detailed supply schedules right up until the end of February, and we're getting increasingly confident about the schedules for March as well at the moment. So these things crystallize and get more granular as we get closer to the delivery point, and we're working on a daily basis with each of the suppliers. So we are absolutely confident that supply will not be a constraint in achieving the February targets to vaccinate all priority 1 to 4 groups. And we're seeing confidence in supply thereafter as well to make sure that we can enhance and increase the deployment.
Well, can I just pick you up on that? You say all priority 1 to 4 groups, but I believe that you're working on the assumption that only 75% of the cohorts will in fact take up the vaccine or be vaccinated.
In terms of vaccine supply, then we are looking at the total 100% amount. So there will be enough vaccine supply to meet 100%. Whether or not that is then taken up is a different issue.
Well, that's right. But the statement that is being made is in absolute numbers and saying it's the total of the cohorts. And that is not, in fact, accurate, because you are working on 75% of 100% of each cohort taking up that vaccine.
Well, we have 147 million doses of approved vaccine. So we've got 100 million doses of Oxford, we've got 40 million doses of BioNTech, and actually you've taken on another 10 of Moderna. So you've now got 17 million of Moderna. So we've got
but it's when those vaccines arrive, though, when those doses arrive. So from a supply perspective, we are looking at 100% of that clinical at need group. When it comes to deployment, how those vaccine doses are then deployed is a matter for Emily and the team to work out how that happens.
That's my point. And therefore, it means that you have to be very careful about the language you use and the accuracy with which you portray this, because if 25% of each cohort does not take it up, then you are not going to fulfill the absolute numbers that politicians are then putting out to the public as being the numbers of people that are going to receive the vaccine. And this business of over-promising and under-delivering is really, really important. So I would like that to be taken away. Plus, of course, when I was skip reading this new report that just came out while we were on air, there is obviously the issue over fill and finish. I wondered if somebody would like to comment is exactly where we are on the fill and finish capacity, because I do understand that you have entered into the arrangement with Wockhart in North Wales, in Wrexham. But is that fill and finish capacity, which is a potential bottleneck, as is acknowledged in this report, functioning at full pace, and is it no longer a bottleneck?
It is not a bottleneck and has never been a bottleneck, and I'm not sure what it says in the report because I've not read it, but that fill and finish capacity is operating as we've contracted it to.
Okay, it says in the report, identifying limited global supply of fill and finish capacity as a potential bottleneck in the manufacturing process, the VTF actually entered into the agreement. So as far as we're concerned, there is no issue and no problem with the fill and finish capacity in the UK.
Well, the fill and finish capacity in the UK is just for the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, and there is no issue with the Wockhart fill and finish. We might also potentially use that for the Valneva vaccine, for the Novavax vaccine that comes later. So we are looking at that as an option as well. Of course, fill and finish is globally constrained, and for some of the other vaccines that are being produced and manufactured elsewhere. There could be potential issues, but we're working with the suppliers on each of those.
Okay, so we're not entirely out of the woods yet on fill and finish.
Well, I think we are absolutely okay on fill and finish for the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine. For the Pfizer vaccine, they have got different issues in terms of their scale up, of which fill and finish is not a particular constraint, but there are other issues in terms of how they're manufacturing and getting to full scale. I think the issue is that with every single vaccine, these are new products with new facilities, sometimes new supply chains, and there are just scale up issues which you're getting the full visibility of, because normally these wouldn't be shown, because you wouldn't be getting the vaccines as quickly and as early as this.
Okay, and then can I just on this particular sort of place and people, I read in the report that you've got 80,000 people that have volunteered on the vaccination program to date. Are you sufficiently satisfied now that you have you can continue to identify and recruit staff as the requirements continue to change? And is there any update on your future recruitment to this program?
Shall I take that one, Chair?
Sorry, Dr. Emily. Yes, I wasn't quite sure who to address it to.
Okay, let me start anyway. So yes, the response to the three national routes which are being used for volunteers and clinical staff to offer their support has been incredibly successful, much more so than we could ever have imagined. And we are now seeing the throughput through those pipelines, through NHS professionals, through the Royal Volunteering Service, and through the St John Ambulance. And I think people may have noted that the St John Ambulance staff being deployed, for example, today in the vaccination centres. There's also been very successful local recruitment, which you don't see so much about, but each system started recruiting back in November or even October, sorry, to make sure that they could meet at least initial workforce levels themselves. And that's so a mix of those locally recruited staff who are at least partly who are based locally is now being supplemented with that national level. And we can see a way through into this scaled up capacity, which obviously we're bringing online in line with the supply that Mr. Elliott's just outlined. So workforce, having been of real concern identified in the report, thanks to all of the efforts that have taken place both locally and nationally, is now really proceeding at pace and will be there for the scale up if it continues as we plan.
Can I just finish my section, because much of it was covered before, by just saying that there is this is a fantastic program. I mean, there is no doubt about it, and I'm second to none in my admiration for the people that are working on this and what they're doing. But there has been some bad publicity attached to it, not least people saying that they have expressed an interest in playing their part, and they've had the bureaucracy that they've had to face, or they've just been ignored. Can we make it very, very clear that everybody that has come forward to volunteer is not only appreciated, but that we do have so many volunteers that we are overcome with the generosity of people wanting to participate? I think this is really important, because we are damaging what is actually one of the most phenomenal exercises that this country and the National Health Service has ever put in place. And I would be very happy to hear a very solid statement like that, perhaps from Sir Simon.
Sir Simon.
I can't hear him at all.
So Simon.
No, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you
now.
Oh, right. Okay, thank you. Well, I was just saying I agree with you completely, Dame Cheryl. I think it has been a fabulous response. As Emily and the report points out, there are over 80,000 people now who are trained and ready to administer vaccines. We've got the St John's Ambulance, the Royal Voluntary Service, and many others. As you also rightly say, that wonderful level of support, we will want to be able to respond and help people help us as the year proceeds, but not all of those people are needed today or this week. And so finding the right way of saying that, as you so articulately put it, I think is crucial.
Well, can I ask you, do you have a rebuttal unit in the NHS? How rapid is that rebuttal unit? And don't you think it would be a good idea to put better identified FAQs on the NHS website so that we can point people towards those FAQs. For example, I volunteered and I appear to have been ignored, because I think that the communications part of this is also part of what is letting us down. Would you agree with that? And could you look into that as a potential answer to some of the issues?
Well, I certainly agree that frequently asked questions on the website would make sense. And yes, I'm sure we can do that very, very quickly.
I look forward to seeing that. Perhaps you'll send me the link. Thank you.
By the end of today. By the end of today.
Thank you.
We'd rather they were accurate than rushed, I think.
Yes,
I think we
agree.
Get this all right. We know we just have to take sort of dictation from Dame Cheryl, and that's the text we're using, essentially.
Flattery will get you nowhere.
Yeah, well, I think you can change the recommendation of the report by that. I think you haven't know Dame Cheryl well enough. But can I just say, Sir Simon and to Dr. Lawson, a number of you will have an interest in this, but we're also getting this in evidence today and in conversations we've had locally and with colleagues around the House, confusion by GPs and others on the ground as well. So communication isn't just to the public. It's vital that people know exactly what they should be expecting and when, because it is those frontline health workers who will get the questions, and if they can't answer them. And that brings me to one question that I've been asked is, are we doing all the over 80s first, pausing in areas like East London, which are young, and then waiting till we get to the 79-year-olds and the over 70s generally? Or is it going to be rolled out more smoothly across the area, the country? Dr. Lawson, can you help with that?
Yeah, so it's not a either or question, but an and question. So I think I mentioned earlier in answer to Olivia Blake's questions that we need to ensure that every PCN has had the chance to vaccinate, particularly the over 80s and their care home residents.
Yes.
So where there are PCNs that have gone, have managed to very successfully vaccinate all of their over 80s, and we have not enough supply to supply absolutely everybody with their full, what they would like to do this week, then we've said, no, it needs to go to those PCNs who've got a much bigger group of over 80s, for example, to get through. However, as soon as we're at a reasonable coverage, I would expect to be able to have a conversation with the CMOs to say, look, we need to push as much vaccine out as we can. And obviously there's a trade-off between ensuring complete equity and the speed of overall deployment and making sure we get vaccines in arms. But what we can't do is have one part of the country running so far ahead of another that there's real inequity there. So it's really a both and conversation rather than an either or. For those PCNs who have covered all of their over 80s, I would argue that they should be making sure that they're covering the care homes at the moment with the additional AstraZeneca vaccine that came in at the end of last week, and possibly extending beyond their PCN. And that's going to be in some communication about care home coverage that we'll send out this week. So there's
some number crunching, but there are some areas. I mean, if you compare, say, Sir Geoffrey's constituency with my own, we compare notes on age profile, massively different. I've got a large cohort, 30 to 35, and relatively few, just between 5,000 and 6,000 over 80, similar number between 70 and 74, for example. It's not, but the danger is we'll set up a system, get all the logistics in place, have all the volunteers helping, and then it stops for a bit, and it's very hard to get it up and running again. So are you bearing in mind the smooth curve of distribution, as well as the obviously vital issue of making sure people in care homes and others are getting it quickly?
We're absolutely bearing it in mind. We obviously also have to act in concert with the JCVI guidance and make sure those priority cohorts are vaccinated as soon as possible across the country, particularly given the data that I think you will have seen on the deaths that can be prevented. So, for 20 vaccinations in care home, that's one death, for example. So it's as much as possible trying to make it as easy as possible for people to do the right thing, get to those critical cohorts as quickly as possible. And that's where places like the large vaccination centres and also community pharmacy can also help smooth the distribution within any particular locality as well. So it's looking across the whole health system to make sure we're using the right mix of delivery models for that particular population and all of the different communities that it represents.
Thank you very much. Dame Cheryl wants to come back. Dame Cheryl? Could you unmute, please?
Yeah, unmute. I just wanted to ask Sir Simon about the coordination and communication with the CCGs, particularly. I heard some anecdotal evidence that the CCGs were being asked not to give out information. And I think I touched on the security side of vaccines right at the beginning of this session. But can you assure me that no CCGs are prevented from communicating with their, for example, local MPs about exactly what is going on? Because I would hate that to be one of those rumours that grew and grew like Topsy. Can you give me an assurance that the CCGs are able to communicate entirely and fully with their MPs on everything that is going on the vaccination programs in their areas?
Yeah, no, I would certainly hope that's right. And as I say, we'll be making the local data available so that they are also able to track back what the uptake looks like in their local areas.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, and are you, and the quality control on the responses you've been getting from CCGs, are you finding there is a variation around the country, or are you finding in the cooperation and the capability of all the CCGs are matching each other, or are there gaps? And if so, how are you going to plug those?
Sure. I mean, I think it's probably about a week, 10 days too early to satisfactorily answer that question, because we've obviously seen this big increase in the amount of vaccination going on this past week, and there'll be a further increase this coming week. So, until everybody's had a chance to, really go hammer and tongs, it's probably unfair to draw too much into any of the differences that might initially appear. But we absolutely are going to be doing that. And we're going to be, we've got mobile teams who are going around to help different services where we can see that we think they could do more or do it differently. And as was set out at the press conference I did with the Prime Minister last Thursday, we also have a mobile, 21 mobile army units that are deployable under the command of Brigadier Prosser and the 101st Logistics Brigade, where that will make a difference.
Thank you very much, Sir Simon. Dame Cheryl?
Yeah. Could you write to us when you reach that point where you've been able to assess the performances across the CCGs and to be able to tell us how you've addressed those gaps and how they've been plugged? Because I think that is a very important area, and it seems to me to be another weak spot in the whole logistics system that we need to have a look at. I can see Dr. Emily is nodding.
Yes, all I would say is it's not just principally CCGs, of course. I mean, this is groups of GP practices through their primary care networks. But in addition, there are the hubs, and in addition, there are these larger scale vaccination centres. So individuals have also got choices. It's not just about the local CCG.
But I think, Sir Simon, Dame Cheryl raises an important point, because a number of MPs have been frustrated about getting information about local data with some sort of suggestion. It's difficult to pin down precisely, but maybe they're not feeling they're not allowed to. So if that statement you've made is helpful, but if you can make sure that that is clear, and MPs and local councillors and so on, and the local people can know what's happening in their area, that would be very helpful. And
because I think it's important to make this point, Chair, is if constituents come to us and we go to a CCG or a group of practices and they're not talking to us or telling us what's going on, we have nowhere to send those constituents except back to their GPs and back into the system, clogging it up. And that is a major problem. We've not got these clear lines of communications where we can quickly get accurate information to people. As the Chair says, I'm not the only one that's experienced this. I think we need to make sure those lines of communication are clear, if that's possible.
Yes, and I mean, I think in addition, we are also doing briefings directly for members of Parliament on the vaccination programme, and the public messaging is, first and foremost, you will be contacted. This is not one of the programmes, unlike the later stages of the seasonal flu vaccination, where people themselves go and maybe present to the local pharmacist. You will be contacted, and that's the key point. We, the NHS, will be in touch with you.
So Simon, everybody on this call and other MPs appreciate the national briefings, but what we need is local information. But I think we've agreed that that's allowed, and you're sanctioning that, and you're going to facilitate that. So that's fantastic. I'm now going to turn to Olivia Blake, MP. Ms. Blake, back to you.
Thank you, Chair. And my first question really is to Sir Wormald, if that's okay. What are the key risks to the public confidence in the COVID-19 vaccines, as you see them?
The key risks to the...
What are the key risks to public confidence in the COVID-19 vaccines?
Well, I mean, I think they're all the things that we've been discussing in this this hearing. The public, as we've just been discussing, wants clear messaging and to understand what is going on. It wants to see delivery go to the and deliver on the promises that the government has made. It clearly wants to be reassured that everything has been done properly in terms of the safety and the deployment of the vaccine. So I think actually this hearing has covered the waterfront very well. I mean, I should say, I mean, it's not, although it's very different in scale, these are issues, of course, that Simon and his colleagues at the NHS deal with every year with every vaccination programme, and the key risks are very similar. The big differences are the scale and the newness of the supply chain. Those are the things which are different from a normal vaccination programme. One of our huge advantages is that the NHS has run programmes like this very successfully for quite some time. That is one of our biggest advantages in this programme.
Okay. Do you feel more could be done to address some of these risks? For example, I know that the report references attitudinal studies that weren't able to be carried out ahead of the rollout. What from the Public Health England?
Yeah, I mean, I do think, I mean, the communication conversation that Dame Cheryl and Sir Simon have just had is absolutely crucial. The communication challenge is, of course, more difficult because the situation is evolving so rapidly, and that does, of course, bring us a communication challenge. But I think the things they were talking about are extremely important. I'll ask Michael Brodie to talk about the attitudinal work, which PHE is very well advanced on.
Mr. Brodie.
And thanks for the question, Ms. Blake. We've undertaken a range of attitudinal surveys. So we've worked under the NIHR programme with Newcastle University and with the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And we do weekly YouGov polling as well. And the synthesis of all of that is that about 2/3 of the population have said that they're very likely to take on the vaccine, and about 10% say that they're very unlikely. The rest are a bit uncertain. And those that are uncertain or are unlikely, as Sir Chris pointed out, it's the efficacy, it's the safety. But actually what we found from the flu vaccination programme, particularly for harder to reach communities, is that it's around convenience, it's around location, it's around the booking system. And I think what you've heard from Dr. Lawson and others today is the robustness of that booking system now, that people are getting their second appointment booked at the same time as the first appointment. The call and recall process is there. We've translated a range of materials into 20 different languages, in Braille, in British Sign Language. We've produced 44 different short videos to support people with information about the virus, about the vaccination programme. And I think what we've learned is that people trust their GPs, they trust local faith groups, they trust community connectors. And that's where the directors of public health and local government have such a strong role to play. So working with our DPH colleagues will ensure that we provide that sort of community cohesion, that community approach to helping address inequalities, as well as getting the mass sort of volume out as well, so that we don't have parts of the community being left behind. So I hope that demonstrates a robustness of approach that we've taken so far.
No, thank you for that answer. And just on communities, I think that there's a question about healthcare professionals taking it up themselves, but also learning disability and what support you're putting in place to make sure that that community is not left behind. You've mentioned BME, so I don't need to ask that, but I really would like to understand a bit more about the invitation letters to the mass vaccination centres and whether they're counting as a vaccine offered. And could that skew indicators? Because just to understand what counts as a vaccine being offered, is it a phone call, is it a letter, is it a text message, and how are you monitoring that really?
So I'll let Dr. Lawson take the second part of the question. On the health inequalities issue, and particularly for people with learning disabilities, we know from the work that we've done within PHE that I mean, COVID amplifies all inequalities, and certainly so for people with learning disabilities. It's a really important question, and if I may, can I come back to the committee with a written note on anything that we're doing specifically for the learning disability community?
I'd appreciate that, thank you. Dr. Lawson?
Thank you. So the question about offering. So we, as I think Sir Simon pointed out earlier, is we're giving people more than one channel, more than one chance to come forward for a vaccine. So the letters went out, they included language that said you may also have already been invited by your GP. You know, it is up to you to choose which is the most convenient opportunity for you. We did obviously pre-screen for people that didn't already have a vaccination record, but it may be that they had it in the in-between period, etc. So we're not limiting the channel that people can choose to go through. Once you've had the vaccination, that will obviously be recorded, and we wouldn't, the system wouldn't invite you again. So that is an offer. We are expecting to, given the criticality of this vaccine, to do a kind of, don't know what the right phrase is, but to go back to people who haven't come, because we won't know why they haven't come, and to give them an additional opportunity to come forward, particularly via the National Booking Service, which is the easiest way for us to do that, because it pulls immediately from the GP record. So people haven't already arrived for a vaccine, to send out another opportunity for them to do so, to make sure we get to as many people as possible.
Okay, just going back over, Michael, Mr. Brodie, it would be really appreciated if you could specify actions around autism, but also those who are illiterate and those who also are without an immigration status in your response, unless you've got anything to add on those issues today in your response to us. Just on...
That's just a nod, Mr. Brodie, you can agree to that.
Absolutely.
Ms. Blake.
Okay. Thank you. Just on, I'm trying to kind of tease out why the flu vaccine take-up levels are a good indicator, and how you're going to monitor uptake, and whether you think that you're ahead of what was expected at the moment. So Dr. Lawson.
I can maybe start on that one for you, Ms. Blake.
Okay.
I mean, the reason the flu vaccine is an interesting indicator is obviously it's the same age group, and secondly, it has been happening at the time of the increased concern around COVID in the older population. So it's the right group of people, and it's happening at the right sort of several months ahead of the COVID vaccination. So that's why it's a leading indicator, but it's no more than that. It's not determinative of what the response will be. But I have to say that at this point, a few weeks into the programme, frankly, we're seeing a very, very strong response from people aged 80 and above. And in a way, that's completely unsurprising, because this is the generation who were children when the health service came into creation in 1948, the generation that's lived through polio vaccination, through tuberculosis, through the advent of meningitis. Many other vaccinations have come on stream, and they have seen the benefit. So frankly, I think, you know, what I'd be saying to my children is learn the lessons from your grandparents. And my parents' generation are coming forward in very strong numbers.
Okay, thank you. Just to touch on the IT infrastructure about the administrating of the programme, I understand that it's one central kind of system, but which hasn't necessarily been used in all the areas that we've got. Would you be able to give us more insight into whether you think that this system is robust enough, Dr. Lawson?
Yes. So,
and perhaps Stephen might want to comment on that as well.
I'm happy to start. So the underlying record of whether you've had a vaccination goes into the National Immunisation Management Service, which pre-exists, and that information is then dropped into your GP record, which has one of two major software systems. And that means that that data is then available attached to your GP record with all the information, which allows us obviously to track the second dose. It also enables Michael's team to look at all of the broader public health issues around it. The data is available, you know, for people to do academic research. You know, SPI-M is going to look at it, etc. So that is the backbone, I think, that you're referring to. What we've put in place, given the existing IT systems, are different ways of the data going into NIMS. So in hospitals, they are either using NIMS directly or they're using NIBS, which is essentially the same interface. In GP services, they're using something called Pinnacle, which is a pharmacy software provision, but it allows that direct drop of the recording of the event into the NIMS database. And the first mass vac sites are also using Pinnacle because that was the right thing to set up, but we will look into them using NIMS and NIVs as we go through for capacity reasons. So it's not as complicated as I think it might seem. And what's absolutely critical is we had to have that ability to know exactly, which vaccine you receive from which batch, on which day, in which place, for pharmacovigilance reasons. So that's why that central backbone is so important, and why every system we put in place has to talk to that system.
Okay, can I just chip in there, Ms. Blake? Because I know from my local area that there's been some delays in updating the records to Pinnacle, or through Pinnacle to the system to get that second invite sent out and so on. Is that a glitch? Is that something that's happening widely? And is that something you're on top of, Dr. Lawson?
So as part of our ongoing operational improvement, we're obviously looking at that data every day. What we identified is that because GPs and their teams are innovating in how they're using Pinnacle, so they are splitting the tasks between multiple people in the surgery. And so the load of inquiries on Pinnacle was much higher than expected when we stood up this additional capacity this week. So we might have 9 different people basically all interrogating the Pinnacle system, if you like, and we hadn't, the team hadn't anticipated that. So Pinnacle over the weekend put in additional capacity into their servers, and they'll do that again on Thursday. But that is, that's so we've now identified that problem. We put a fix in. I would imagine that as we go through, we'll find there'll then be a pinch point in it, and we'll need to innovate around that as well. So at the moment, it's
within 7 days or so, typically, from what you've said.
Yeah, we're going to increase the capacity. We're also going to look at, to plan for future robustness as we scale up. What alternatives would be available? How long would it take to put them in place to make sure we've got?
But Chair, just to, if I can just underline one sort of point sitting behind what Emily's saying. The design principle in this programme was essentially to use the current well-tested local vaccination information systems rather than to try and do some separate vertical big bang IT project. So the systems that Emily describes are the well-established systems that GPs and pharmacists and the rest of the NHS uses for all sorts of other vaccination programs. Obviously, there are unique features here. The volumes going through are high. There's a need to connect to the way the larger scale vaccination services work through the national booking system. But this is not some new bespoke IT program. This is essentially just using the resilience and the experience that exists in a distributed way through well-tested information systems around the NHS.
Thank you. So yes, quite different to other approaches by government. I have to comment, but Ms. Blake, back to you.
Yes, very different. Can I just ask about responsibilities and where it now lies? I think it was a bit clearer earlier on who was responsible for what, but if you could outline who you think has ultimate responsibility for delivery and how we're taking, how we can make sure that everyone's accountable for the delivery of this.
Yeah, shall I start? And I expect Sarah Mumby will want to add. I mean, it's really quite simple. The BEIS side of the house and the vaccination task force is responsible for purchasing, manufacturing, and delivering to the health system, and then the health family is responsible for delivery from there into people's arms. So there's a very, very clear division of responsibilities and an accountable officer agreement between me and Sarah Mumby about all that. But as I said earlier, it's while that's a very clear division of responsibility and means that everyone is focused on the things that are in their competency field, it is very important that each of those things is informed by the other, and therefore people from the health family side of the house are part of the governance and oversight on the as part of the vaccines task force, and likewise people from the vaccines task force are absolutely crucial to informing the delivery decisions that we make as part of our governance structures, and it basically works like that. And as I hope this hearing has demonstrated, has worked very effectively so far. And personally, I think it's one of the best examples of cross-departmental working to achieve a single goal that I have seen. But Sarah may want to add.
Nothing to add, but for the sake of putting it on record, I agree completely with Chris.
Thank you very much, Ms. Mumby. Ms. Blake.
Just finally, there's been some talk about batch testing kind of holding up a supply of vaccines coming online. Is that accurate? And should there be more being done to improve capacity at that batch testing stage of the process?
So the way it works is that the MHRA does two things. The first thing is to assess the clinical efficacy and safety, to make sure that the data from the phase 3 trials actually support the claims that these vaccines will actually protect the individuals who need it most, and it's safe for those people. The second thing is to make sure that every single dose of vaccine that is delivered is consistent and meets the quality standards that are defined by the regulator, which is why we can't just ship in any old vaccine into the UK. Everything that goes into people has to be approved by the MHRA. Now, you can't do those batch testing experiments until you've got the final commercial batches to test. So these are things that are just sequential in how they're done. Everything that can be compressed, that's been done ahead of time in terms of expecting and predicting what resources and assays and reagents are going to be needed, has been done. But there are certain things you just can't compress. For example, there are sterility tests where these are time-based tests to ensure there are no nasties that are growing up in the vaccines. You can't compress those because that is just a straight time. So you can sing to the cells, you can do all sorts of things, but you can't actually compress things further. So again, everything that can be compressed and shortcut through planning has been done. But we're not changing the fundamental bars of safety, which is completely mandatory, that we make sure that the vaccines that we then put into people meet the quality standards and have been approved by the MHRA. So these are all things that if you sat in our steering committees, we've been talking about for weeks and months, and we knew that we've got these different hurdles we've got to get through, and we've absolutely compressed what we can, but there is just a limit as to what can be done given the pace at which this is being scaled up.
Thank you. Mr. Elliott, briefly.
Yeah, I'd just like to put on record, we've been working very closely with both the suppliers and the MHRA in the form of NIPS, which is their organisation which does the testing. I'd just like to say they've been absolutely fantastic all the way through. So there's been no hold up from what the MHRA have had to do in terms of releasing batches. So for example, all of the Pfizer batches were in this country by the 23rd of December, ahead of schedule, having passed all of their batch testing. And the same is happening now with the Oxford vaccine. So everything that can be done is being done.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Blake?
That's everything from me, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I just ask, well, Ms. Bumby, I guess, probably maybe Dr. Lawson, has there been any impact, or are you expecting any impact because of Brexit on the supply chain of any of the vaccines that are not being manufactured in the UK? Dr. Lawson.
I think that one is for us in the sense that they're still with us at the point at which they come over the seas. And the answer is no. But as you can imagine, we've had very extensive multi-layer contingency plans in place, including air freight if necessary. So it isn't something that even if there had been significant delays at the border, we would have been worried about fundamentally disrupting the programme.
And is it practical to air freight the Pfizer vaccine because of the cold storage? That's okay. That's okay. So it's not.
It is okay. We managed to get all the Pfizer vaccine into the country at the height of the borders being closed because we had contingency plans in place. So as I said, all Pfizer vaccine was in country by the 23rd of December, and that included transit over the period when the border was, going through its issues.
Right, great. Well, that's heartening to know. And then I want to move on and back to you, Ms. Mumby, about the vaccine task force and why it was necessary to establish a vaccine task force. Was it that the system didn't have a system good enough in place? What was the thinking behind setting up this particular task force?
Well, 1 second of history first. So in April, really quite soon after the whole thing kicked off, Sir Patrick Vallance brought together a group of experts to look at vaccines. We had people in the department who worked closely with our researchers working on it. There was activity happening across the system. What I think became quite clear quite fast is that this was a huge cross-government, at pace, at scale effort. And no, the government doesn't have a standing pandemic vaccine function at the kind of scale of the VTF that exists all the time. That wouldn't be a good use of people or money to have that wait, for decades for the moment to come along. The answer is to be able to build fast when you need it. And so the VTF was created in order to give senior focus, the right governance, the right people to a really big cross-government problem.
Okay. So was it part of pandemic planning? I mean, yeah, a decade ago, I remember, or just over that, sitting on a cabinet subcommittee dealing with then pandemic planning. So was it something that was in the plan to have a task force like this, bringing 200 people or so together to deliver, or was it something you did on the hoof? I say on the hoof, that sounds pejorative. I mean, you had to do it quickly, but was it something you thought of in the moment, or did you had you had any planning in the departments?
I don't actually know the answer to that question. I would say that at the time the decision was made, it wasn't a particularly difficult or tortured decision to create the VTF. We needed a function. We were able to set it up quickly and efficiently, so we did so.
Okay.
I can possibly help, Chair.
You've been around a long time, Chris.
Sorry?
You've been around a long time, you have the history.
Oh, thank you very much.
It's a positive thing. The civil service moves on too fast most of the time.
I've lost my thread now. No, vaccines have always been part of the pandemic plan. Of course, as you know, the major planning that was done was for a flu pandemic where there are pre-existing vaccines. So the question would be converting. Here we were in the situation where we had a pandemic for a disease class for which there has never been a vaccine. So it was a rather different challenge. So there was lots of planning for vaccines and vaccine deployment. Of course, as I said before, building on what the NHS does anyway, but there was a unique challenge here to which a unique solution was developed at speed, but building on what was there already. So, for example, the expertise that the government has permanently in the purchase of vaccines in PHE and elsewhere was at the disposal of the task force. So it was new, but building on what was there already.
Can I then ask, well, I'll start with you, Sarah Mumby, but do deflect to other colleagues, other permanent secretaries or Sir Simon if necessary. You've got this task force that's done a challenging job, bringing 200 people together, including people from outside Whitehall. So I think 79 of that 200 were from outside Whitehall. How are you going to make sure that you're up to speed in getting, continuing with the current vaccine program, but also potentially having to procure new vaccines for different variants? And so on. I mean, is it going to become a standing part of business, of government now?
Well, certainly for the moment, yes. So currently the vaccines task force is still in existence. It's still got over 200 people working in it. It's going at absolutely full pelt, and we've got no plans to change that. Clearly, if in due course it became obvious that this problem had become much more straightforward, then you could find a different solution. You would certainly scale it down. But I think this comes back to the uncertainty about what the future vaccine program will look like, depending on progress of both the virus and the technology.
One of the interesting things about this, of course, is it brought together people from inside and outside Whitehall. And we know on this committee, we often talk about the skills in Whitehall, and you wouldn't have people with Dr. Bingham's experience sitting around in Whitehall as a civil servant, not doing this normally. But there are challenges when you bring people in from the private sector. One, keeping them standing when you need them. So how are you doing on holding in private sector expertise, first of all, that you think you need, and how are you holding on to that, or making sure that you've got access to it?
To date, we haven't had problems holding on to private sector talent. I think because this is an issue of, absolute #1 national priority, and the best way to motivate and retain people is to give them something that really matters to work on.
But then one of the challenges, of course, about having people come in from the private sector and then go back out to the private sector again with access to Whitehall is that there can be huge issues around conflicts of interest. And I'll come to Ms. Bingham in a moment on some of the challenges that she's faced in that respect. So how do you manage that as a permanent secretary? You were the accounting officer responsible for the expenditure, but the vaccines task force was really driving this through. So where did you fit in this, and how do you make sure that when people leave, they're not making money out of their Whitehall knowledge that's not necessarily benefiting the private sector? It's a challenge that we've grappled with on this committee for some time. So how are you grappling with it now in real time, Ms. Mumby?
So I think there was a smaller question in that just before I get on to conflicts of interest and how that's managed, which is just about the fundamental accountability structure here. And I think it's worth saying for the record, the formal accountability runs very clearly through Nick to me. So that's the setup here, that there isn't a different structure, and all of the decisions that we've talked about what's value for money, what should be signed and so on, have gone through the standard departmental projects and investment committee that advises me, have gone through my sign off and have gone through ministerial sign off. So just to sort of put to rest any concerns about the way the formal accountability works.
Okay, but had there been I mean, that's interesting you say that, because that's yeah, as the report lays out, we know that that's what officially happens. And I'll come to Ms. Bingham in a moment. I don't talk about you, Ms. Bingham, without talking with you, but if you hold for a moment. But if there had been a disagreement between the chair of the vaccines task force at any point and the civil servants directly through the accountability line, how would you have managed that as a permanent secretary?
I mean, the same way I would manage a disagreement, say, between two of my DGs in the normal course of doing business. I'd look to understand what the issue was, talk to them, attempt to reach a sensible, balanced answer. But ultimately, the accountability and the decision-making lies with me, reporting up to the Secretary of State.
Okay, and so Chris, in terms of the accountability, obviously you've got a big part in this as well. Are you content with the accountability processes, and how do you make sure that conflicts of interests, which I need to come back to Ms. Mumby on, are not are managed?
Well, it's the same answer as Sarah has just given. We haven't changed the accounting officer structure or the ministerial decision-making structure for any of this, other than, as you know, adding an extra accounting officer who comes to this committee quite a lot. But other than that, we have used exactly the same structures that we normally do. And as Sarah says, you manage the conflicts of interest in the same way as you would manage any conflicts of interest. The DHSC faces this challenge the entire time. We have, as you know, a very, very large drugs budget in the normal course of events, and we need expertise from the pharmaceutical sector and elsewhere in order to be able to deal with that, and you manage any conflicts that arise via the standard procedures. And I mean, the general principle from what Sarah's said is exactly right. The important thing in these situations is you double down on the existing systems. You do not create new ones.
Okay.
And it's that it's creating that balance where the government can get it the advice that it needs, while ensuring that decisions are taken in the proper way by the proper people.
Okay, well, Ms. Mumby, just going back to you on this conflict of interest, because 38 members of the task force registered as potential conflict. Can you tell me, was that split across people who come through the civil service and people from the private sector, or was it more in the private sector? I imagine it might be more in the private sector.
The majority of those would have been through colleagues brought in through the private sector. I think it's important to say that in a lot of those cases, the conflicts of interest that we're identifying are small. That doesn't mean they don't need to be managed. They absolutely do need to be managed, but it might be something like you have a shareholding in a particular company, you declare that, and we ask you not to trade in that company for the duration of the information being relevant. It's not necessarily a kind of major conflict of interest that goes to sort of the heart of your role. If it were, then obviously you wouldn't be able to do that role. So actually our business as usual conflicts of interest system, although it's needed to be scaled up to deal with the quantity of people coming in, not particularly because they've been more conflicted than usual, but just because there've been more of them coming in from the private sector. And the Vaccines Task Force has had some dedicated people focused purely on the question of conflict of interest, just to deal with that scale of flow. But the usual process that we use with making sure we examine, understand, and then take individualized mitigations on each person who declares a particular conflict of interest, I don't think we've had to change that, and I think it's worked well.
Can I just turn to Nick Elliott, and I'll come to you, Ms. Bingham. How have you made sure, in your role as the Civil Service Accountability Line, that people who've left the task force haven't had any personal or professional profit that's inappropriate as a result of their work? And how are you policing that?
So when they leave, there's a process that everybody goes through in terms of making sure they're signing non-disclosure agreements, making sure they understand what's they have signed up to over the time that they've been working for government, so that they're very clear about it. Over and above that, I think it's quite difficult to actively police it, but I think people are very clear about what their responsibilities are at the point in which they leave, and we make sure that is done as part of the organisation and the discussion that happens when they leave the. Have you had
to put any people on gardening leave so that there's a kind of buffer between what they're doing with the vaccine programme and Whitehall and what they go and do later?
We haven't had that yet, but we haven't had a huge amount of people leave, other than Kate, who I'm sure we'll come on to in a minute. Then, most people that we brought into the programme are actually still working on the programme. We haven't had a significant number of people leave from the private sector at the moment, so it's not been an issue we've had to face yet.
Okay. So, Ms. Bingham, you've had a rocky ride. You've been criticised for connections you've got, and yet what you're doing is quite a rarefied area of work. Do you think when you got the call, from the Prime Minister, did you think you were the only person who could do this? Or, I mean, are there lots of people in your sphere who could have possibly been the chair of the Vaccines Task Force?
Well, my reaction when I first got the call was to say, remind them that I'm not a vaccines expert. My role over the last 30 years has been taking novel science and turning those into therapeutics. So those are drugs that are treating patients with actual diseases, as opposed to vaccines where you're prophylactically giving these people vaccines to healthy people. So there is a distinction in terms of business model and what the ultimate product is versus what I'm used to. So are there other vaccine experts out there? Of course there are. But what I now realize is actually the venture capital skill set and the biotech mindset is exactly what was needed, because what I spend my life doing is basically surveying new science and products and biological areas, working out how you can actually evaluate those for, in my case, therapeutic intervention, showing that they're effective, showing that they're safe, making sure you can make them and you get the regulatory approval so that then you can start to dose. So the concepts and the activities are the same as with vaccines. But the reason why I think a biotech mindset and a VC mindset is helpful is, first of all, my experience is we invest our own money. So every cent of my investors' money includes my own money. And so that means we're very focused on not funding stuff if we don't think it's going to succeed. We're very focused on making sure things do succeed. And we're very focused on doing things quickly. And because I've been in the industry for a long time, obviously I've got a very broad network of people across pharma and biotech. So that meant it was very easy for me and the team to be able to pick up the phone and speak to people. But are there other people better qualified? I'm sure there would be.
Okay, so then, I mean, you got a call from the Prime Minister. We know in a pandemic you can't go through a full recruitment process, but do you think that you'd have been saved a lot of pain if there'd been some discussion with other people? And do you know if there was discussion with other people about taking up the role?
Well, remember, I was on the Vaccine Expert Advisory Group first, so that wasn't an appointment process either. So I'd attended all those meetings for probably 4 to 6 weeks before, since it was first launched. So I imagine, and I'm not privy to whatever process took place, but I imagine there was a discussion that looked at initially the members on the Vaccine Expert Advisory Group, because they're the people who had been most exposed to what the government was doing and what the government was seeking to do. And maybe because I'm B, I was early on in the list. I don't know, but I don't know what the process was. I just know that I received the call and I made the point that I'm not a vaccine expert. But in hindsight, I think I do have some of the skills that have been helpful.
Ms. Mumby, were you at all involved in the appointment and looking at the people, the expertise around, and how did you decide who would go onto the original vaccines body before the task force was set up?
I wasn't privy to this specific appointment, although I would very much agree with Kate that I think in hindsight it's turned out to be a rather good one in terms of efficacy of the task force operation. And we, I think, owe big thanks to Kate alongside all of the other members of the Vaccines Task Force for everything that they've done. The External Advisory Board, which was appointed before the creation of the Vaccines Task Force and the appointment of the DG and so on, was appointed in consultation with Patrick Vallance, and the names of who's on that group are public. You can look at them yourself. You'll see a broad range of different representation from business, academia, and others.
Okay, so, but I mean, it's just, we know that there's a sort of group, there's names that get floated around in Whitehall appointments. I mean, I've been involved in appointments in one way or another for nearly 25 years, and the same few people come up again. That might not always be a bad thing, because sometimes people are very expert, but it can mean other people get cut out. I think we'll leave that bit there for now. But I think, in terms of your what you've learned from this, Ms. Bingham, would you do it again?
Yeah. I mean, I would absolutely do it again, because I think we've been incredibly successful, and we've actually been able to deliver the 3 objectives that the PM set. So secure vaccines for the UK, secure vaccines for internationally, and put in place plans to make sure that the UK is better set up for the next pandemic, of which there will be another pandemic, and more so, than we are now. So I'm very happy with what we've done. And yes, I would. Even knowing what I know now, I would still do it again.
And did you think there were any conflicts of interest? How did you handle that when you were first appointed? Did it cross your mind that this might be an issue?
Well, I'm regulated by the FCA, so I'm highly attuned to conflict of interest. And just to give you an example, any company with whom we've had a discussion at the Vaccine Task Force immediately goes on to my restricted list at SV. So I'm not naive when it comes to understanding conflict. Having said that, I do not invest in prophylactic infectious disease vaccines. It's just not been a historic area of focus of our funds, nor is it likely to be in the future. So albeit companies, for example, like Johnson & Johnson and Janssen are big vaccine providers, they're also big pharmaceutical companies. So the fact that I have relationships there has been helpful for vaccines, but it's not something that relates to my underlying work as a venture capital investor.
Okay, so you say it's not likely that SV Health is going to invest in any of these. Are you? There's a little equivocation there. Are you ruling out that you'd invest in vaccines in future, having gone through this process, or are you saying that you might?
No, the prophylactic vaccines for infectious diseases is not something that we will invest in. The ambiguity comes where you've got companies that have drug discovery platforms that could be applied, such as Moderna. So Moderna, I mean, we're not an investor in Moderna, we're not going to be investors in Moderna, but that, or BioNTech, those are companies that have had their platforms validated, their mRNA platforms validated through the COVID-19 vaccines. Their business models, if you went back a year ago, had nothing to do